And I feel a bit cautious, nervous about giving a talk I'm going to give to all of you wonderful people who've been working so long and so hard, but things are really grim. Germany's Foreign Minister, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, said the NATO war exercises in Poland are warmongering. Bill Perry, who used to be Secretary of Defence, is writing articles saying we're really close to nuclear war. General Butler is saying the same thing, and many others. And we are. We're closer to nuclear war now than we were really during the Cold War. Simply because no one knows what's going on, and we're sort of sleepwalking to Armageddon. While a State Department staffed by neoconservatives like Victoria Nuland and her husband Robert Kagan, who has an enormous influence, and Susan Rice, who's the US UN representative, they are actively pushing Putin. They think that they can get rid of Putin. They do, and they've been writing about this, and Robert Parry, who's a wonderful journalist, who writes for Consortium News, talks about these people. I mean, how dare they think? How dare they think they can get rid of Putin? Who are these people? And Putin has enough weapons to destroy life on Earth, let alone the whole of America, and turn it into a burning radioactive mass, burning coast to coast, north to south. I don't know if they even know that. I don't know if they practice psychic numbing. These people are psychologically sick. Because if we have a nuclear war, we're all dead. I just went up and looked at the puffins in Maine yesterday. I went out and watched the whales leaping out of the water and turning somersaults. I look at the dogwoods. I look at my grandchildren. I look at little babies just learning to walk, staggering along. We won't be here. It's not just us. It's the whole thing. And these people are pushing. Let's step back a bit. When Gorbachev agreed with America to end the Cold War and let the Eastern European countries become independent, America promised that she would not enlarge NATO. Now, what is NATO? North American, what is it? Yeah, you all know. It's really America. They run the whole thing. But it wasn't good for the military-industrial complex, and these people are wicked. Norman Augustine, who was the head of Lockheed Martin at the time, and Lockheed Martin has just produced the anti-missile missiles that they've placed in Romania. Well, having no war is bad for business, and they can't steal your money, and 65 cents out of every discretionary tax dollar goes to killing. And I can't understand the American people. They sort of lie down in front of this notion of national security. I don't understand their attitude. And yet I've just driven through a lot of Maine and New Hampshire. The whole country's swathed in flags. It feels like Germany. What's this flag business? You're not the greatest country on earth. I mean, how dare you think you are? And you're not the you say you're the policeman of the world. We don't want to be policed by you. We've got bases in Australia, Pine Gap, that orchestrates the launching of nuclear weapons, spies on everyone in Australia, and we're not even allowed to go in there except make the beds. And the rent is 1 peppercorn per year. And our government just lies down in front of America. You know, I don't know. Anyway, so what happened was Norman Augustine went to these newly liberated Eastern European countries, and he said, you want to join NATO and you want to have a democracy. Well, this isn't a democracy, is it? Most people don't vote or participate. Some people do. Bernie would have saved the world. It's too late for Bernie now. It's too late. Anyway, so he persuaded these Eastern European countries to join NATO, but to join NATO you have to militarise to the tune of about $3 billion, you see. And so that was great for Lockheed Martin. So it was all done for money, right up to the border of Russia. Now imagine if Russia came over and Canada was an ally of Russia. And so Canada said, look, we're going to be an ally of Russia and we're right next to you. Remember what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis? I knew Robert McNamara. He was in the Oval Office at the time and he said, Helen, you don't know how close we came. 3 minutes, he told me. And that was just because there were some missiles in Cuba. But can you imagine how the Russians are feeling? Being locked in, NATO is enlarging and having huge troop exercises in some of these Eastern European countries, being incredibly provocative. Incredibly provocative. They've just put this anti-missile base in Romania and they're going to put one in Poland. My name is Noski, so I'm of Polish extraction. And the Poles have a very right-wing government now. Right-wing meaning, I don't know, blow up the planet. What does right-wing mean? Don't know. And Putin is being provoked. And I think he's very sane. If you read recent speeches by Putin, he's being very constrained and very sane. Thank God. So then, the Ukraine. Victoria Nuland orchestrated the coup in the Ukraine. It was orchestrated by her. She was in Maiden Square handing out cookies to people. And that's when there were people firing into the crowd, and that's when Yanukovych, he was scared. He was an elected prime minister, and what happened was that the EU approached him to see if he would join the EU. And when you join the EU, you have to tighten your belts, like Greece has had to do, and you have to eliminate healthcare and free education. And he wasn't keen to do that, so he talked to Putin, and they decided, look, let's give it 6 months and we'll work out what to do. In the interim, that's when Victoria Nuland et al. Moved into the Ukraine. And the Maiden Square massacre started the whole revolt, and we ended up with a man called Poroshenko, who's a real crook. And there are Nazis, there are a lot of Nazis in the Ukraine, you know, as a hangover from the last war, and they've got the power. Meanwhile, the people in eastern Ukraine are very Russian. They all talk Russian, and they want their free medical care. They want their free education. So Putin helped them a bit, but the people under Poroshenko and the military are going in and killing those people. So it's very provocative. And then the Crimea, which has been a part of Russia since Catherine the Great, they decided they'd like to stay with Russia. So what the administration and the mainstream media, including the New York Times, which orchestrated the Iraqi invasion by printing 5 articles by Judith Miller on the front page, and she was actually sleeping with Scooter Libby, who was part of the whole thing. I mean, I know Judith Miller. And she, and the New York Times apologized for that, but she was very instrumental in persuading Americans to go into Iraq, and look what's happened. Over 1 million people have been killed, and as Madeleine Albright said, when asked on television if it was worth it to kill 500,000 children in the Ukraine, she said, yes, I think it was worth it. I don't know if these people have any humanity. You know what war is? It's butchery. It's butchery. It's tearing human bodies apart. It's pigs snouting around in the bodies of dead babies, and no wonder your poor troops who come back have post-traumatic stress syndrome, and they're suicidal, or they drink, or they kill themselves. Because they're brought up in this society which everyone's nice, and some people believe in God and go to church or whatever, to be put into that situation where there is absolute butchery. And I don't understand why men kill. Yeah, I suppose we've been killing each other since we were troglodytes. When we were breastfeeding the babies in the caves, we needed strong men to kill the saber-toothed tigers and the marauding tribes. And I think it's inbuilt in the male brain to be aggressive. Testosterone turns on the male brain, but there's been recent work done, and I'm writing a book about this, where the centres for violence and sex in the male brain they overlap. And you know, when you have an orgasm, you get that lovely feeling, dopamine, the release of that gorgeous hormone. Well, violence also releases dopamine in the male. And I'm exploring why men, I'm talking all over the place now, but why men rape women after they've conquered a territory. What is that about? What is the relationship between sex and violence? Why do they play porno films for pilots taking off from aircraft carriers, going to kill people and bomb people? What is the relationship? And I think as a physician, unless we diagnose the cause of a disease, and this is truly a disease, we can't cure it. Until we found the polio virus, Jonas Salk, etc., we couldn't stop polio. So if we don't find the cause of a disease, we can't cure it. What is the cause of the disease infecting the human race, which is killing? And if you look at how the Pentagon people talk, they talk about missile erectors, soft laydowns, deep penetrations, or having a nuclear explosion with one big orgasmic wump. And they talk like that in front of women with no sense of embarrassment. So I think it's important to try and dissect the relationship between killing and sex and violence. That's what I'm doing in the book called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them. Why are we so pathetic? Why is it men that run the world and we stand back? So often after a speech, people will come up and a man will say something and I say, that's a great idea, why don't you run for Congress? And he sticks his chest out and says, yeah. And a woman will come up with a magnificent idea and I said, you should run for Congress. And she literally takes 2 steps back and says, who, me? The truth is that 52% of the world's population are women. We produce hormones that are nurturing, like estrogen, progesterone, and oxytocin. And oxytocin is really nurturing, and I know that it's secreted during lactation. When I was breastfeeding my babies, I really felt I could feed the world. And I used to cook wonderful dinners and then go to sleep in the soup when everyone turned up because I was so tired. If you give males oxytocin by nasal inhalation, they become soft and loving. And there was an experiment done in a lab in California where they were measuring hormones, and the woman running the lab noticed that when there was an altercation, the men would typically go into their office alone, shut the door and ruminate. The women would come in the next morning and clean the benches and make coffee and want to fix things. So she measured the hormones. And the men's testosterone went sky high and the women's oxytocin went up. So we've got something incredibly important to offer, yet we don't use it. We feel inhibited, and you know, when you go into Harvard Square, there's statues of men everywhere, which really gets under my skin. Because often, many revolutions are instigated by women. The Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, and the like, but we're written out of history. So we need a major change. And we need people to understand what is happening to the planet and to understand that we may not be here much longer. I once asked Carl Sagan, who is a friend of mine, do you think there's any other life in the universe? And he paused for a long time, and he said, no. And I said, why? And he said, if any species had reached our stage of evolution, they would have destroyed themselves. And I think we need to start thinking really deeply about what we're doing. There are flashpoints in the world now. There's Syria, and America orchestrated the invasion of Syria by Hezbollah and all of those groups. I can't remember all their names now. There are so many, ISIS and the like. And they're being funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, I think, and I think Turkey, to get rid of Assad because Russia's got the only naval base in the Mediterranean in Syria. And it goes way back. I heard Julian Assange, you know Julian Assange, that Australian who's locked up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, who released all those emails, WikiLeaks. He said that there's evidence in all those emails that America was planning this years before it happened. And if Assad gets killed, he is a Alawite. And there are a lot of people, Alawite Muslims there, and Christians and the like. And if America prevails, all those people are just going to be killed and slaughtered. So that's a flashpoint, and Russia's entered the Syrian conflict to try and support Assad. So that's one flashpoint. The second flashpoint is the Ukraine. And of course, well, you know what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. America keeps killing and killing and killing. And who do they kill mostly? Civilians. Or the drones. Have you seen the men at the drone terminals? They're sitting there and they've got their wife at home who's cooking the dinner and the children. And there's a wonderful film with Helen Mirren called, what's it called? Iron Sky. Brilliant. And she's the commander in the British Air Force, and the drones are looking at the various people they want to kill. And there's a little girl selling bread, and they don't want to kill her, but they need to kill the other people. But suffice it to say, they do eventually kill her and the other people. And Obama's been deeply involved in drone warfare, killing people by long distance. And I remember when it was first developed, certain people in the military said it's great because we won't lose any soldiers. We can just, and what happens to the people orchestrating the drones and killing these civilians and the children, and they see the remains of the bodies, they go home to their wives and have their dinner, but they get terribly disturbed, as they would. I can't imagine killing anyone. I took the Hippocratic Oath and I've spent my life trying to save people. If someone wanted to shoot me, they can shoot me. I'm not going to kill anyone. Thou shalt not kill. So we've got the Middle East, and then America has decided to take most of its ships from the Persian Gulf and transfer them to the Mediterranean. More provocation for Russia. Obama's decided to move his military and navy to the Pacific, and he's done a rotation so that he can take on China. America's ringed China with anti-missile bases, and she's ringed Russia with anti-missile bases. And it's all for the military-industrial complex, and you don't even know what's going on in your name. And they're all, I once called 128 America's Death Highway. This is where they all live, and lots of them in Boston. And unless we find out what they're doing and expose them, we're doomed. And people say, well, the person who interviewed me, where is he? Here he is. David? He said, well, what can we do? The most important thing is to be really well educated, to know exactly what you're talking about. And then you have to go with your passion and to understand that there's nothing else in the world that matters. Whether the children clean their teeth or have a good education, because they don't have a future. And we're not even mentioning global warming now. But this is an acute catastrophe that it could, I said to my family, well, I'll be home and I'll see you in Australia if there's not a nuclear war, and I mean it. I mean it. Meanwhile, the men in the missile silos in South and North Dakota and Colorado, they're military officers, Air Force officers, and they are the ones that launch the missiles. Each has in charge of a missile wing with 150 of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and each missile has 3 hydrogen bombs much bigger than the Hiroshima bomb. And they sit there all day waiting to press the button if they get the message. They are operated, the computers, by floppy disks, and the telephones don't always work. And they get very bored, and I think I've mentioned it already, take drugs and do all sorts of things down in those silos. Now, when there's an international crisis like 9/11, the Air Force raised its alert to DEFCON 2, which is just before DEFCON 1, which is launch. And what happens is, if the satellites pick up an attack in space coming from Russia, then that message comes back to Stratcom, and then it's sent over to the White House. And Obama has 3 minutes to decide whether or not to blow up the planet. And you know, they always carry a suitcase. There's always an officer walking behind Obama with a suitcase with the codes to start a nuclear war called the football. When Reagan was shot, they lost the football for about 3 days. And so what happens is the message comes to the White House and he has 3 minutes to decide. And it's not whether to not have a nuclear war. There's counterforce, which America has worked out to strike all the missiles in Russia before they're launched and win a nuclear war. And your policy still is to fight and win a nuclear war. Or counterforce and what's the other one? Counterforce. The other one is just to hit the cities, or else the third one is to hit both cities and the silos. And well, Russia doesn't want you to win a nuclear war without launching her missiles. So if you decapitate Moscow and decapitate Putin, that's the military term, so he can't launch his missiles, then by launching a hydrogen bomb on Moscow, they've dug a deep hole in the Ural Mountains with a single rocket that goes up called the Dead Hand, which sends out a signal to all the Russian missile silos to launch the Dead Hand. And I know the guy who designed that. He actually subsequently died. So and I don't understand why Obama, who was so concerned about nuclear war and gave that wonderful speech in Prague, what has happened to him? Is he just so intimidated by the power of the Pentagon? I would have had fun if I was president. I would have launched right into them and embarrassed them and made them ashamed on television and educated the American people and taken them with me like FDR did. And we've just been up in Campobello where FDR summited and where he got polio. He was almost your last great president, but we're in a terribly serious situation. And David said to me, well, what can I do? And I suppose I give the example, I came here in 78 and almost all Americans I talked to said it's better to be dead than red. And I thought, these people are psychotic. I said, well, what about the pygmies in Africa? And they said, no, it's better they're not communists either. Having no concept of nuclear war. So we orchestrated the physicians for social responsibility, and we described the bombs dropping on Boston and all across the country. And the Bishop of Boston, or Archbishop, or whatever he was, would wake up the next morning and see on the front of the Boston Globe a map of Boston with the concentric circles of destruction and fires and vaporization, and he'd say, I don't think Jesus would approve of this. And so gradually the Catholic bishops got together and wrote a pastoral letter opposing nuclear war, and so did the Methodists. But you know, over 5 years, PSR educated, and WAND and all the other groups here, educated the American people 80% became opposed to the concept of nuclear war. And Randy Forsberg, that wonderful woman who wrote The Freeze and who subsequently died, she and I kind of worked together like that. 80%. We had 1 million people in Central Park, the biggest rally in the history of America. And then the Cold War ended. And we were so tired. We just lay on our couches and said, thank God. And they talked about the peace dividend, but never underestimate the evil of these sociopaths who run the military-industrial complex, and they are sociopaths. Brilliant, erudite, charming, and no moral conscience. 1 in 25 people are sociopaths. And they rise to the top like cream. Rumsfeld, Cheney, all these people you know, because they've got this neurosis to drive them, and they're very clever. Cleverer than we are, in a way. I think for those who haven't heard this description before, I do need to describe what would happen if Putin accidentally, or you need to know there are over 1,000 hackers into the early warning system or into the Pentagon per day, legitimate hackers. And the missiles are on computer control. And Stephen Hawking and Max Tegmark and the AI people now say that by the end of the decade, it's possible computers could take over and launch nuclear weapons by themselves. And you know how computers are taking over your life now. And they're really worried. And it's interesting because they're very worried, but they're not doing anything about it. It's like the guys who made the first nuclear weapons, Oppenheimer, et al., they were worried, but they couldn't stop themselves. And so these AI computer guys can't stop themselves. They're sick, because they know. So imagine, okay, we're here, we don't have NPR on, but sometimes, I don't know if it still does it, but they sometimes go, oh, we're just testing the emergency broadcasting system. Do they still do that now?
Yes, they do.
Well, that's if there's a nuclear attack, and it takes half an hour to complete. Run to the nearest fallout shelter. Won't do you any good. And the bomb takes half an hour. Well, the missiles are multiple independent re-entry vehicles. They could be 3 or 5 or 6 bombs on one missile. And they each leave the bus, which is the missile, and the bomb, which are the passengers, go accurately to land on all the targets. Every town and city in America with a population of 50,000 or more is so targeted. There are about 12 targets in New York. All the airports, the tunnels, the most important parts of New York, 12. And each bomb is a hydrogen bomb by orders of magnitude bigger than Hiroshima. And the Russian bombs are big. They're the bombs you've got to be worried about because they're targeted on you. So we don't hear NPR. The bombs come in at 20 times the speed of sound and explode with the heat inside the centre of the sun, actually hotter than the sun. And they dig a hole, one bomb, 3/4 of a mile wide and 800 feet deep, turning us and the Prudential Centre and the like to radioactive fallout shot up in the mushroom cloud, and all that dust and earth shot up in the mushroom cloud. 20 miles from there, everyone is lethally burnt. People lying in what is left of the streets in dreadful pain, thinking, why didn't I do something about this? The White House has been stockpiling huge quantities of morphine just in case there's a nuclear war, but we'll be dead or injured too. The doctors, no hospitals, nothing. And a burnt case takes years to help to heal. People will be sucked out of buildings with winds of 500 miles an hour as the fires draw in a massive amount of wind. And they just get sucked out of the windows and turn into missiles travelling at 100 miles an hour. Shards of glass travelling at 100 miles an hour penetrate human flesh. There's a book put out by the Pentagon with equations about how far a piece of glass travelling at 100 miles an hour penetrates human flesh. They've got it all worked out. If you look at the flash 20 miles away, you'll be instantly blinded. And as the whole of America is carpeted with bombs, and so is Russia, so is Europe, so is Canada, which is part of NORAD, so is Australia, so is England, so is Japan, so is China. Since the Cold War ended, America's decided to target them too. And as the fires burn and the cities are full of carbon and wood and plastic, all of this stuff rises into the stratosphere with this huge updraft. And these clouds cover the earth with a cloud so thick it blocks out the sun for up to 10 years. Hence, we will enter another ice age, where nothing grows and we will all die freezing to death in the dark. Even if there was no cloud, the ozone depletion is so severe that people who survive will go instantly blind with 5 minutes exposure to the sun. And I can talk about other things like millions of dead, decaying bodies and viruses and bacteria mutating in the radioactive environment to become more virulent and aggressive. They had plans, the Pentagon for us, that we would stay in the shelters and the old people would go out and gather food, which would be radioactive, because we wouldn't live long enough to get our cancers. I can go on and on. You know, there was a man called T.K. Jones in the Federal Emergency Management Agency. He said, "Don't worry, if we've got enough shovels to go around, we'll all make it." And as you hear the warning of the bombs coming, you get out the trusty shovel and you dig a hole 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and you get in the hole. And then you put 2 doors on top of the hole and dirt on top, and he said it's the dirt that does it. If there's going to be a nuclear attack, odd-numbered plates, cars leave Boston to go to certain designated places, and the next day, even-numbered plates go, but you mustn't take any drugs or alcohol. You take your shovel, because if the bomb's going to land, you dig a hole and drive the car over the top, so you'll probably be okay. You have to leave food for the pets. This is your government. This is your protection. And what I'm so deeply concerned about as I read everything that's happening is we're on the brink. And I look at these lovely kids out here at Harvard, and beautiful Harvard. It's not just psychic numbing, because they don't know. It's the media that's determining the fate of the earth. What did Marshall McLuhan say? The media is the message. So look, I don't know what you're going to do, but you can all be as powerful as Henry Kissinger if you decide. If you've got that burning passion in your soul. You look in the mirror in the morning and think, what's life about? How privileged am I to even be conceived with the millions of sperm that night that your father produced, each one different, met your egg? What a privilege it is to exist. And what responsibility do we have? Not just to humans, but to evolution, this magnificent planet of ours. So I'll leave you with that. Just that we're all physicians to a dying planet. The earth is in the intensive care unit. That's our responsibility. And each one of you, you've got congresspeople and you've got senators. Elizabeth Warren should be talking about this. They should be having a sit-in on the floor of the House right now about this. Yeah, it's important about guns, but guns are nothing compared to this. So, get moving, if you've got the energy. I don't know what else to say. Thank you.
We're going to have a little time now for some questions and answers.
Hezbollah is actually a Lebanese Shia group that is defending Syria and the Syrian people from the US-Saudi invasion. The groups that the United States and Saudi Arabia and Turkey are sponsoring are ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, and Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Islam and other groups.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you. It's just terribly complex, and I get terribly mixed up reading about all these groups.
Yes.
And talking about nuclear weapons, what about nuclear power? What do you tell people about who are talking about global warming and where nuclear power fits in?
Well, what did Einstein say? The splitting of the atom changed everything on Earth, save man's, and I stress man's, mode of thinking. Thus, we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe, and nuclear power plants are really atomic bombs in situ. Huge amounts of radioactive material inside them and in their cooling pools, and now they're closing them down at Pilgrim and Diablo Canyon. But we're left with the waste, and the waste lasts for up to 1 million years and has to be isolated from the ecosphere for 1 million years. No one knows what to do with it, and they've got a thing called the Waste Confidence Bill. The nuclear industry is confident that in time we'll develop an answer to the storage, safe storage of radioactive waste so it doesn't leak into the environment. As it gets into the environment, like Fukushima, where 400 to 500 tons of radioactive water a day are entering the Pacific, coming over to the west coast and concentrating in the fish by orders of magnitude. You know, you can't taste, smell or see material that's radioactive in the food. You don't eat a piece of fish and say, I can taste the strontium-90 in this fish, or the cesium-137. And so what we're doing is leaving to our descendants this hideous situation, which, if we don't blow ourselves up in a nuclear war, which I think at the moment, to be quite frank, is unlikely, what are they going to do with it? In fact, they employed anthropologists in the Department of Energy to find out what sort of signs they put on these radioactive waste storage things, like a skeleton and how do you stop people digging into them? I mean, what we've done is absolutely hideous. And the nuclear industry has an enormous amount of power, and the politicians don't understand science. They're scientifically and medically illiterate on the whole. And they just lie down in front of these people from Los Alamos and the nuclear physicists, and they get whatever they want. And these people are sociopaths too, because they know what they're doing. They know damn well what they're doing. And Pilgrim should be shut down now, because it's one of the most dangerous reactors in the country. It's a Mark I GE reactor, the same as the Fukushima reactors. And I knew the 3 GE engineers who designed those reactors in Fukushima, and they resigned in 1975 saying these reactors were too dangerous, and they testified before Congress. But what difference does it make? The industry is so god-awful powerful. And so they're keeping it open, obviously. They can make it $1 million a day by selling the electricity. And you've paid for the whole thing. You pay for the insurance, you pay for the building of the reactor, you pay for, you know, enriching the uranium, you pay for everything, and then they get the money. These people are, I mean, you've got to call them out, and I have to say that this is a very conformist society. Everyone says, have a nice day. I don't want to have a nice day, and don't tell me to have a nice day. I might be having a nasty day, but that's my business. Everyone has straight teeth and white teeth, you know? And what do they say when you buy anything at a shop now? I mean, it really gives me the dry rot. So you've got to be game enough to step out and speak your truth. And only then do you become a leader.